Welcome back to the another episode of Teleclass. This is Santosh from Imagine School. Before we start this lesson, please you go to this link and mark yourself as present, or you can use this QR code, or you can scan this QR code to mark as present. So today's lesson, we are going to discuss about the changes in market equilibrium due to the simultaneous change in demand and supply. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to draw and explain what will happen to the market price and market quantity if there is a simultaneous change in demand and supply. And at the end, you should be able to explain and draw the demand and supply diagram according to the scenario. So before we move on to this topic, just have a look at this summary of the previous lesson we discussed. So in the previous lesson, we discussed about the impact on market price due to increase in demand, decrease in demand, increase in supply and decrease in supply. So look at this effect on this market equilibrium. So the first step, we should draw the demand curve and supply curve, and the P is the initial equilibrium price and Q is the initial equilibrium quantity. So increase in demand will shift the demand curve to the rightward. So look at this, demand curve shift to right as D1. Now we are getting the new equilibrium point where new demand curve intersect the supply curve. So look at this point E1. So E1 is the new equilibrium point. As a result, what is the equilibrium price or market price here? Yes, exactly. So the market price increased to P1 from P, and the market quantity increased from Q to Q1. And the important point is, if there is an increase in demand, there will be a movement along the supply curve. Look at this. The supply on the supply curve, there is a movement of the point from E to E1, because here due to the increase in demand, the price of the product increased to P1. So already we learned, when the price increases, there will be an extension of supply. That means the point moving from E to E1. So this is very important. Whenever there is an increase in demand, there will be a movement along the supply curve or extension of supply. And look at this impact of decrease in demand. So we know decrease in demand means the demand curve will shift to left. So the initial equilibrium price is P and quantity is Q, and look at this demand curve shift to left, that is it shows decrease in demand. So as a result, what is happening? The new equilibrium point we are getting, that is E1, and this will reduce the market price from P to P1, and market quantity decreased from Q to Q1 as well. And here look at the movement along the supply curve. Decrease in demand will lead to movement along the supply curve, means contraction of supply. So decrease in demand will leads to contraction of supply. And the next one, increase in supply. What will happen to the market price if there is an increase in supply? So increase in supply means supply curve will shift to right. So look at this increase in supply. As usual, initial equilibrium price is P and equilibrium quantity is Q. And look at this, supply curve shift to right to S1. That means S1 curve shows increase in supply. And as a result, we are getting the new equilibrium point E1. And at this point, what is the equilibrium price? P1, and equilibrium quantity increased to Q1. So what is the impact of increase in supply on market price and market quantity? Yes, exactly. So the increase in supply will decrease the market price and increase the quantity. And opposite, what will happen to the market price if there is a decrease in supply? So already you should know this. So what is happening here? Decrease in supply means supply curve will shift to right, and as a result we are getting the new equilibrium point here A1, and the market price goes up to P1. and market quantity decreased from Q1. And here there is a movement along the demand curve. So keep it in your mind, whenever there is a increase in supply, there will be a movement along the demand curve. Means increase in supply will lead to extension of demand, and decrease in supply will lead to contraction of demand. Look at this, here decrease in supply, so the point moving from E to E1, so that means a leftward movement along the demand curve. So these are the very important information about the market equilibrium. And let's have a quick look at the summary of the previous lesson. The reason for change in demand and change in supply is non-price factors, of course. Due to the non-price factors only, the demand might increase or decrease, or supply might increase or decrease. And an increase in demand or increase in supply shift the curve to the right. No matter whether increase in demand or increase in supply, curve will shift to right. And a decrease in demand or decrease in supply will shift the curve to left. So no matter whether increase in demand or decrease in demand or decrease in supply, the curve will shift to left. And finally, an increase in demand cause an extension of supply, just before we explained, and decrease in demand cause a contraction in supply, and an increase in supply cause an extension in demand, and decrease in supply cause contraction in demand. So these are the summary of the previous lesson. So far we discussed only about the change in demand or change in that supply, or only one change at once. Now we are moving on to the simultaneous change in demand and supply. So what will happen to this market price and market quantity if there is a simultaneous change in demand and supply, which means both demand and supply curve shifts, increase or decrease? Then what will happen? So look at this. Always, I told you always, the increase in demand means rightward, and decrease in demand means leftward. Increase in supply rightward, decrease in supply leftward. This idea you must have. Look at the effect of increase in demand and supply. So in order to get the result, we have to start with the original equilibrium price. So DD is the original demand curve, SS is the original equilibrium, and P is the original equilibrium price, and Q is the original equilibrium quantity. Then what will happen? The question says effect of increase in demand and increase in supply. So increase in demand means the demand curve will shift to right. Look at this, rightward shift of the demand curve. Still you can't find out the equilibrium point because one more shift is there. What is it? Increase in supply. So look at this, the supply curve will shift to right. So now we are getting the new point where the new demand curve and new supply curve meet. Where is that point? So this is the new point where new demand curve and new supply curve meet. So at that point, what is the price? Price remains the same. But what happened to the quantity demanded? Quantity demanded increased from Q to Q1. So what is the impact of increase in demand and increase in supply on market price? Yes, exactly. What happened here? The market price remains the same and market quantity increased. And the next, decrease in demand and decrease in supply. Decrease in demand and decrease in supply. What is happening here? Look at this. So as usual, the original demand curve we drew, and next decrease in demand means the demand curve will shift to left. Look at the demand curve shift to left. But still you can't find out the equilibrium point. We have to go for decrease in supply. Look at this, supply curve shift to left. Now we are getting the new point where new demand curve and new supply curve meet. That's the point here, E1. So as a result, what is the impact? So market price remains the same and market quantity decreased. That's the effect of decrease in demand and decrease in supply on market price. So here you don't want to by heart these things. The diagram will tell you what is happening to the market price and market quantity. So look at this. And next, effect of increase in demand and decrease in supply. So here we must have an idea. Increase in demand, which means demand curve will shift to right. Decrease in supply, which means supply curve will shift to left. So look at this. Demand curve shift to right to D1 and supply curve shift to left, which shows that increase in demand and decrease in supply. So what is the consequence here? What is the impact here? Look at this new equilibrium point we are getting here, E1, which means market price increased, but market quantity remains the same. So market quantity remains the same and market price increase. This is the effect of increase in demand and decrease in supply on market price. And next, effect of decrease in demand and increase in supply. So here demand curve will shift to left and supply curve will shift to right. Look at this initial equilibrium and the demand curve shift to left shows decrease in demand and supply curve shift to right, that is increase in supply. So we are getting new equilibrium point here, E1. So what is the impact? Just look at the diagram and exactly it says that the market quantity remains the same and market price decreased and market quantity remains the same. So as a result of this change, market price decreased and market quantity remains the same. Next, increase in demand is more than the supply. So far this demand and supply change simultaneously with the same percentage of increase or decrease. Now again we will have different scenarios, means increase in demand can be more than increase in supply, or there will be a small change in demand and large change in supply. So how do we show this? Next, increase in demand is more than the supply. What's the meaning of that? Both demand and supply increasing, but increase in demand is more than the supply, means the distance between demand curve would be high and the distance between two supply curve should be small. Look at this initial equilibrium. So the increase in demand is more, so large or the more distance between two demand curves, but the supply change should be small. Look at this. And what is the impact? We don't want to by heart these things, just look at the diagram and where is the new equilibrium point? Here, which means what is happening? Market price increased and market quantity increased. That means a small change in market price and large change in market quantity. And again, increase in supply is more than demand, means both demand and supply increasing, but increase in supply is more. See, the supply curve shift to right, big change, and demand curve shift to right, that also shows increase in demand. But look at this distance between these two here. So supply curve large increase and increase in demand is small. So what is the effect? Just look at the diagram and you can see that here market price increased from P to P1 and market quantity increased from Q to Q1 as well. And decrease in demand is more than supply. So in this case, demand curve shift to left. That means here decrease in demand is more change in demand, and supply also decreasing but small change. So look at this demand curve large change and supply curve small change. Now the new equilibrium point is formed, that is E1, and at this point, that point is called new equilibrium point, and at this point what is the price? Price is P1. And what is the market quantity? Q1. So what is the impact of this change? Market price decreased from P to P1 and market quantity decreased from Q to Q1. And decrease in supply is more than demand. Both demand and supply decreasing, but decrease in supply is more. So look at this diagram. Supply decrease, more decrease, big distance, and demand also decreasing but small. Look at this. And new point or equilibrium point is formed here, that is E1. So as a result, what happened? Price or the market price increased from P to P1 and quantity decreased from Q to Q1. And next, increase in demand is more than decrease in supply. Increase in demand, demand increasing more, but supply decreasing. But supply decreasing means small decrease in supply. Look at this, more distance and small here. So as a result, what is happening? E1 is the new equilibrium point we are getting, and at this point price is P1, which means price goes up. And what's the quantity? Quantity also increasing from Q to Q1. Next, decrease in demand is more than increase in supply. So here demand curve shift to left from D to D1. Big change in demand, and supply change should be small. Look at this, small change in supply. That means even though supply increased, but that change is very small. And so this change leads to new equilibrium point. Where is that? Here, look at this, E1 is a new equilibrium point. And as a result, what is the equilibrium price? Equilibrium price decreased from P to P1 and quantity decreased from Q to Q1. Then increase in supply is more than decrease in demand. Increase in supply, more change, look at this, more change in supply, and demand decrease, small change. So here we are getting new equilibrium, that is E1. As a result, what is happening? Market price decreased from P to P1 and market quantity also increased from Q to Q1. Next, decrease in supply is more than increase in demand. Look at this, decrease in supply, big change in supply, and small change in demand. That means demand increasing at small quantity, but supply decreasing at large quantity. So as a result, what is happening? New equilibrium point is E1, and where the price is P1, which means price goes up from P to P1 and quantity decreased from Q to Q1. So these are the different scenarios of change in demand and supply. So I have practice questions and homework. So before that, I'm going for a break, but you will stay tuned. Okay, welcome back. So based on these different scenarios, I have one questions, that is last year IGCSE questions, that is, say, look at this, analyze the using a demand and supply diagram how fall in price of cotton would affect the market for cotton shirt. Normally this demand supply diagram carries 6 marks, that most frequently question from this IGCSE. So look at this last year questions. Once again, analyze using demand and supply diagram how fall in price of cotton would affect the market for cotton shirt. Price of cotton, what happened? Fell, decreased. Then what will happen to the market for shirt? So here this is a scenario normally they will give, like this they will give. So from this scenario we have to identify what will happen to this market for cotton shirt. So here what is happening, we have to identify, or we should know that the cotton is the raw material of cotton shirt. So whenever the price of cotton increases, the cost of producing shirt will increase. Then what will happen? What will happen to the cotton shirt if there is an increase in cost of production? Already we discussed, when the cost of production increases, supply will decrease. So here we must have that idea and go for a diagram. So here first step should be demand curve and supply curve. Demand curve and original equilibrium price and original equilibrium quantity. So here what is happening? Y-axis, x-axis. Y-axis labeling is very important. Y-axis we have to write price, and x-axis quantity. So here price and quantity. Then next step we have to draw demand curve and supply curve. So demand, supply. And where is the equilibrium point? Here is the equilibrium point. And at this point, what is the equilibrium price? Draw towards the y-axis. So here it is equilibrium price, and initial equilibrium quantity is here Q. So this is the original equilibrium price and original equilibrium quantity. Here itself you will be awarding 2 marks. Means the demand supply diagram 1 mark and this labeling 1 mark. So 2 marks. But still we didn't get into the question, but you are getting 2 marks. Then we should know what is happening here. What is happening here? The cost of production, how fallen price of cotton, fallen price of cotton. Price of cotton falls means cost of production falling. Cost of production falls, supply will increase. And if the cost of production rises, supply will decrease. So here fallen price of cotton, which will reduce the cost of producing shirt. So what is happening here? The supply will increase. The new supply curve we are getting. So this is new supply curve. And where is the new equilibrium point? See, look at this. Here it is new equilibrium point. And as a result, what is happening? Market price decreased from to P1 and market quantity increased to Q1. So this is the diagram based on this question. So analyze using demand and supply diagram how fall in price of cotton affect the market for cotton shirt. So supply of shirt increasing. And here how the mark will be allocated here. One more mark here, you are getting that new equilibrium price and new equilibrium quantity. And 1 mark for this shift of the curve. So the total you will be getting 4 marks for this diagram. And another 2 marks would be for explanation. So here clearly says that analyze using demand and supply diagram. So we have to analyze. Analyze means you can't simply explain this diagram, price is the P, Q is the quantity, like that. So we should clearly explain what happening there. So how do we explain this? So here you have to explain that due to fall in the price of cotton, so the cost of producing cotton shirt will decrease. So this will increase the supply of product. So the supply will increase, as a result the supply curve will shift to right, and this movement or this change will bring new equilibrium price, that is it reduce the equilibrium price from P to P1 and increase the quantity from Q to Q1. This should be the answer. So in order to get that 6 marks. So these are past paper questions. So I have some questions for you to do. Look at this. First question. Using demand and supply diagram, analyze the effect of an increase in the cost of producing copper on the market for copper. When the cost of producing copper increases, what will happen to the market for copper? The same way you can use this diagram. So demand supply diagram, first initial things, and you have to know what will happen there. and based on that you can change the curve. And next, second one, the effect of removing indirect tax on the market for mobile phone. The important part is here removing indirect tax. Indirect tax is removed, then what will happen to the market? So just like x-axis, y-axis, equilibrium or original equilibrium, then the new curve. We should identify whether increase in supply or decrease in supply, increase in demand or decrease in demand. And the next one, the effect of falling the price of frozen yogurt on the market for ice creams. Fall in price of yogurt on the market for ice cream. What will happen to the market for ice cream if the price of frozen yogurt falls? And next one, using demand and supply diagram, the effect of increase in demand for cars on the market for tires. What will happen to the market for tire if there is an increase in demand for car? So you should identify whether it change demand or supply, increase in demand or decrease in demand, or increase in supply or decrease in supply. And finally, the effect of analyze the using demand supply diagram, the effect of increase in price of butter on the market for margarine. What will happen to the market for margarine when the price of butter increases? So all these questions carries 6 marks. The same steps you can follow. First, x-axis, y-axis, original equilibrium and labeling. There itself you will be getting 2 marks. And go to the question. Based on the question or based on that scenario, we have to identify what is happening exactly there, and based on that you can draw the new curve and find out what happened to the market price and market quantity. So that's all for today. At this end of this session, so we will be back with another topic. Till then, bye.